This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order Dominaria United right now by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and it's that time again, set review season. The entire card gallery for Dominaria United went up today, and it's my goal to get you ready for the new limited format by reviewing every single card in the set before your pre-release, and before it becomes available on Magic Arena on September 1st. As usual, we're starting off with a look at the colorless and multicolored cards in the set. These cards do a great job of introducing us to the various two-color archetypes in the format, so it's a good place to start. The multicolored cards also tend to be some of the most powerful cards in each set, so that makes it extra fun. Tomorrow, we'll take a look at every white card in the set, and the day after that, we'll look at all the blue cards, and so on until the review is complete. Before we jump in, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, remember, this is a limited review. That means I'm only talking about the viability of cards in this video for limited formats, which are draft and sealed. That also means I'm only talking about cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, because I'm reviewing these cards ahead of time, I am, of course, going to be wrong about some of them. That's the nature of a set review. Throughout this limited season, I'll talk about how my thoughts on the format are developing in the weekly Saturday limited vlog that I do, and I'll also do a video about what I got wrong about the format shortly before our next preview season. Lastly, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on cards in my set reviews, and if you're unsure what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive right into the Dominaria United set review. So first, we have a colorless card, Karn Living Legacy, which costs 4 generic mana and is a legendary Planeswalker Karn at Mythic Rare. He has 4 starting loyalty. You can use his +1 to create a tapped Power Stone token, which is an artifact with tap, add colorless mana. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. His -1 says, pay any amount of mana. Look at that many cards from the top of your library, then put one of those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And he has a -7 that gives you an emblem with tap an untapped artifact you control. This emblem deals 1 damage to any target. This Karn really doesn't seem very good. That's true in Limited, but I think it's probably true about other formats too. He can sort of ramp your mana, but the Power Stone he creates, first of all, is tapped when he comes into play, and the mana from it can only be used on abilities and on artifact spells. That is a really narrow use in a format that doesn't actually have that many artifacts in it. It has a decent number, but we'll see there's several artifact-themed cards in the set. I think they're mostly here to sort of seed constructed for all the artifacts we're going to see in the next set, Brothers War. Because a lot of the artifact payoffs in the set just don't look like they'll be good enough, and this is an example of that. His most attractive ability is definitely his -1 in Limited because, you know, he can draw you cards, but it's really annoying that you have to pay mana to do it, and you can use his Power Stone for this because you're not using it to cast a non-artifact spell, you're using it for his ability. But yeah, part of what makes Planeswalkers great is that you don't have to pay mana for their loyalty abilities, and for this one, you do. And then his emblem just isn't going to matter in Limited either, so he doesn't protect himself. He doesn't really have an impact on the board in any way, shape, or form. And his main use in Limited is just that he can draw you cards. If you play him on a board that's pretty stable, you can certainly use his minus ability to draw some cards, but having to pay mana for it definitely matters. I think this Karn is just a D in Limited, and honestly, I have a hard time seeing him being that good in Constructed either, although we're likely to see some artifact-heavy decks in the future. Alright, so Karns are only straight-up colorless card that's not an artifact. Now we're going to move into multicolored cards before ending on actual artifacts. So our first multicolored card is a Johnny Sleeper Agent, which for 1 generic, a green, and a green-white hybrid Phyrexian mana, and 1 white mana, is a legendary Planeswalker, a Johnny at Mythic Rare, and he starts with 4 loyalty. He is completed, which means that you can pay for that green-white Phyrexian mana either by paying green or white mana, or by paying 2 life. If you pay 2 life instead of paying mana, he enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. He's got a +1 that says reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature or planeswalker, put it into your hand. Otherwise, you may put it on the bottom of your library. He's got a -3 that says distribute 3 +1/+1 counters among up to 3 target creatures. They gain vigilance until end of turn. And he's got a -6 that says you get an emblem with whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker spell, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. So this is a lot better than the Karn we just saw, but I still don't really think it's anywhere close to a bomb in limited. Drawing cards with this +1 is nice, but sometimes it just turns into Scry 1, and that's not awesome. If you already have a board state, his -3 is really powerful, and I think that's where most of his value will come from, as it can really buff up the board, and the fact he gives them vigilance sort of means he lets those creatures protect him to some extent too. If you complete him, you do get to cast him for only 3 mana, but he can only use his +1 in that situation, and then his -3 on the next turn would kill him because he'd be out of loyalty. So casting it on 3 doesn't really seem that great when the -3 is really the ability you're hoping for most of the time. Basically, he needs to come down when you're already in a pretty good spot, or he isn't going to help you that much. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it is Aeron, Benalia's Ruin, who costs 2 white and a black for a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian human. At uncommon, it's got Menace, and you can pay a white and a black and tap it and sack another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So, as we've seen lately, all the signpost uncommons in this set are pretty pushed. They're some of the best cards for those decks that are in those color pairs, and that's certainly true here. Pumping your whole board is great, and it is a little awkward that it's an ability that makes you lose 1 creature to put counters on other creatures, because then your board's not as wide. But there's lots of expendable bodies in the format. You can find places to sacrifice things and buff your whole board. You can threaten to do it, when you attack. It's just a very powerful ability, and he even puts a counter on himself. Some of these effects don't, but this one does. And the baseline here is that he's a 3 mana 3/3 with Menace. That's already a pretty nice card. The only real downside about the card is the casting cost is a little challenging. Actually having double white and 1 black on turn 3 is far from a guarantee, but it's not that hard. This format looks like it has pretty good mana, and 2 colored decks can cast stuff. It would just be way easier to cast if it was 1 white black, and it isn't. Still, very good card, and it's a signpost uncommon that I think you can think about first picking pretty regularly, despite being multicolored. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Astor, Bearer of Blades, who for 2 generic, a red and a white, is a 4/4 legendary human warrior at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 7 cards of your library, and you may reveal an equipment or vehicle card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Equipment you control have Equip 1, and vehicles you control have Crew 1. This is really good. You don't even need a ton of vehicles and equipment to make him do his thing, because he looks at the top 7 cards and you're playing a 40-card limited deck. You really just need 2 to 3 vehicles or equipment in your deck to get a hit with him pretty often. And then he offers a pretty nice upgrade to all of those cards once you get them. Lowering Crew to 1 and Equip to 1 definitely matters. So that all comes in addition to really solid stats as a 4 mana 4/4, and he's usually going to generate a 2-for-1 for you. Because he digs so deep in your library, I don't really even think he needs a build around grade. It won't be that hard to just end up with the things that he wants to have in your deck. You don't have to go crazy and get 7 equipment and vehicles to make him do his thing. 3 is enough, and so I don't think there needs to be a build around here, giving him a B+. Next up, it's Baird, Argivian Recruiter, which for red and a white is a 2/2 legendary human soldier at uncommon, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power greater than its base power, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. This is another really strong signpost uncommon. Red-white this time around is about having higher power than toughness, which is a pretty cool spin on an aggro archetype. Baird will be able to crank out tokens pretty regularly and looks like a great engine. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Balmor, Battle Mage Captain, which for a blue and a red is a 1/3 legendary bird wizard. At uncommon, it's got flying, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain trample until end of turn. Very nice spell payoff here. This trigger is really strong, even if you only have 2 creatures, and it's the kind of thing that your opponent has to respect. The threat of activation here is very real. The question is, how easy will it be to go wide enough to really take advantage of this? But my feeling is you don't really have to go that wide with it. And maybe it's a little awkward that, instants and sorceries normally don't make creatures, and this wants you to be going as wide as possible and also casting instants and sorceries. But I think you can end up with a reasonable mix in blue-red decks, which are, of course, spell decks in the format. So I think this is another very good signpost uncommon and another B. Next up, we've got Bortuk Bone Rattle, which for 4 generic, a black and a green is a 4/4 legendary troll shaman at uncommon, and it has a domain effect. So domains are returning mechanic from the last time we went to Invasion Block. They did a lot of nostalgic Invasion Block things in this set, which is pretty cool. That's the last time the Phyrexians tried to invade Dominaria, so makes sense. And what domain means is you get some sort of effect related to the number of basic land types among lands you control. So in other words, you can only max out at 5 basic land types. And in this effect, Bortuk Bone Rattle enters the battlefield, and if you cast it, you get a creature card in your graveyard. You return that card to the battlefield if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of basic land types among lands you control, otherwise put it into your hand. So, another very nice signpost uncommon. A 6 mana 4/4 that gets back a creature from the graveyard is already like a C, but the upside of straight up reanimating things is pretty incredible. You'll usually be able to reanimate a 2-drop when you cast this, and reanimating something that costs 3 or 4 seems pretty doable in the format. Sometimes you'll even do 5, which will be insane, but don't really expect that to happen regularly. I think sort of 2.5 is probably the average you're going to get here, and that's plenty good for this to be another B. Next up, it's Elas Ilkor Sadistic Pilgrim, which for a white and a black is a 2/2 legendary Phyrexian core cleric at uncommon. It's got Death Touch. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. And whenever another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. So we saw Aaron earlier. The 2 of these are telling you this is a sacrifice deck. This gives you a payoff when things die, and Aaron sacrifices things to make your board better. So this is a 2-mana 2/2 that can trade for anything, while also really impacting the game with this incidental life gain and incidental life loss. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it is Urtai Resurrected, which for 2 generic, a blue and a black, is a 3/2 legendary Phyrexian human wizard at rare. He's got flash, and when he enters the battlefield, you choose up to 1. Counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, its controller draws a card, or destroy another target creature or planeswalker, its controller draws a card. So obviously letting your opponent draw a card isn't amazing, but the fact that Urtai can flash in and destroy pretty much any creature or counter pretty much any spell makes up for that, especially because you're also adding a 3/2 to the board. In terms of cards, this means you and your opponent are breaking even, and you're usually going to get a great advantage when it comes to tempo. Giving them that card is not ideal, but what this card does and how flexible it is at doing it makes it powerful enough that it would be pretty busted if they didn't get to draw. Worth noting that in a pinch you can use this on your own stuff if you really need to draw a card or get rid of some creature. I think Urtai is a B. Next up, it's Garna, Bloodfist of Keld, which for 1 generic, a black, and 2 red is a 4/3 legendary human berserker at uncommon. And whenever another creature you control dies, draw a card if it was attacking. Otherwise, Garna, Bloodfist of Keld deals 1 damage to each opponent. This is another great signpost uncommon, and it might be the best of the signpost uncommons in the set. It is just very powerful. It has passable stats to begin with, and it makes your opponent's life incredibly difficult. If you're attacking them, the best they can do if they want to trade is get 2 for 1, which is pretty insane. So the turn you play Garna and you have like a 2/2 and a 3/3 in play, and your opponent has, a 3/3 in play, let's say, you can then just attack them with, well, either of them, both of them, and feel fine, because even if they block the 2/2, you at least get to replace it. But you probably only want to attack with the 3/3, and there's no way they block, because you get to draw a card and you get to 2 for 1 them on every trade where you're the attacker. And I like that they still gave her an effect when you are the defender. It's just that, it deals 1 damage to the opponent. Not as good as drawing a card, but you do have an effect that's going to trigger when your stuff dies no matter what. And the attack trigger is what makes this really strong. And I really love that it impacts the board immediately the turn you play it. You do need to have something going on your board, obviously, but generally you will. And then you can just attack with the things you have in play, and your opponent just sort of has to groan and probably just take the damage. I think she's a B+. Next up, it's Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief, which for a green and a blue is a 2/1 legendary fairy rogue. At rare, it's got flying, and whenever a player casts a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy, you may copy that spell, and the copy targets Ivy. This has nice starting stats and an interesting ability that lets you double your combat tricks and auras while also letting you get extra copies of any aura or combat trick your opponent plays. That stuff is of course going on in the format, but it is sort of a pretty situational trigger and she's good, but probably just a B-. Next up, it's Joyra, Ageless Innovator, which for a blue and a red is a 2/3 legendary human artificer at rare, and you can tap her to put 2 ingenuity counters on her. Then you may put an artifact card with mana value X or less from your hand onto the battlefield, where X is the number of ingenuity counters on Joyra. So I do think this is a build around. Like I said earlier, there are artifacts in the set, but not enough to make an artifact payoff like this super easy to use. She of course has a decent baseline as a 2-mana 2/3, but if her ability is irrelevant or close to it in your deck, you probably don't really want to play her, as actually casting her on turn 2 is a bit rough with the mana requirements, and a vanilla 2-mana 2/3 isn't that great in limited anyway these days. Obviously, paying 0 mana for a 2-mana artifact is great, but it just won't line up often enough. She's going to be a D+ in your typical deck in the format, and probably a C+ in a deck that has, I don't know, 3 or more 2-mana artifacts. Obviously, she can also do stuff with 4 mana and 6 mana artifacts. It is a little awkward. She skips the mana values in between, but obviously she's really powerful, even if you can just put one thing into play with her. So yeah, definitely a build around. Next up, it's Joda, the Unifier, who costs 1 of each mana, and is a legendary human wizard. Legendary creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. And whenever you cast a legendary spell from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a legendary non-land card with lesser mana value. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This format does have 5-color potential. I mean, Domain is a thing people are going to want to be doing, but I don't really feel like Joda will be worth the trouble. While this particular video might make you feel like this set is loaded up with legendaries, we're seeing almost all of them in this video. There aren't very many monocolored legends in the set, and there really aren't that many uncommon legendary creatures in the set apart from the signpost and commons. So you're relying mostly on rares and mythics. So there just aren't enough legendaries around for Joda to consistently do his thing. Obviously, if you get like 4 or more legendary creatures and you have really good mana, he starts to get interesting. But between the requirement to have legendary creatures, a resource that there aren't so many of in the set that you can just make it happen, and the requirement to have good enough mana to cast Joda, I think Joda is unfortunately probably just a D. Obviously in a vacuum, Joda's like an A+. If you can build a deck around Joda and know you always have really good mana, Joda's like an A+. But making that happen is next to impossible. Next up, it is King Darien, the 48th, I think. And for 1 generic, a green, and a white, it is a 2/3 legendary creature, human soldier at rare. Other creatures you control get +1/+1. You can pay 3 generic and a green and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on King Darien and create a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And you can sacrifice King Darien to give creature tokens you control hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So this King Darien is very strong. It's already really good as a 3-mana 2/3 that buffs your whole board. That's like a B at worst. And he comes with all kinds of other stuff, including an ability that generates tokens while making him larger, which is a great mana sink, and the ability to make tokens hexproof and indestructible, though he does completely give himself up for that one. There are plenty of tokens in this format, and the green-white deck is going to be able to go wide pretty effectively, so I think he's just a bomb. I'm giving him an A-. Next up, it's Lagomos, Hand of Hatred, which for 1 generic, a black and a red, is a 1/3 legendary human shaman at uncommon, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 2/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next instep. You can also tap Lagomos to search your library for a card and put it into your hand. You can only activate that, though, if 5 or more creatures died this turn. So, another really good signpost uncommon. You're almost never going to get the tutor effect going. You'll either have to wreck your opponent, or you'll both get wrecked, or you'll really get wrecked. You have to have a lot happen in a single turn. 5 creatures dying in a single turn isn't the easiest thing to manufacture in Limited. But that's okay, because generating a 2/1 red elemental creature token with trample and haste in every turn is pretty good. It's a free attack every turn. There's no reason you shouldn't attack with it most of the time. And your opponent has to decide whether you have a combat trick, whether you can, mess up their block. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong for them. It's also a body that you can use for sacrifice stuff, and that's nice too. So, generating this token every turn is a very real, powerful effect, and I think that alone is enough for this to be a B, and the occasional upside of, getting to Demonic Tutor, whatever you want, is pretty sweet. Next up, it's Myria, Scholar of Antiquity, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 legendary elf artificer at rare. You can tap an untapped non-token artifact you control to add green, and you can tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts you control to exile the top card of your library, and you may play it this turn. So, again, there is an artifact sub-theme of sorts in this format, and if you can get enough of them, especially non-token ones, then Myria will be pretty strong between producing mana and effectively drawing you extra cards. But I think it looks hard enough to get enough artifacts to really make her work that it's hard for me to really go above a C here. Next up, it's Niall, Avazoa Aeronaut, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 2/4 legendary elf scouted uncommon. It's got flying, and it has a domain effect, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. Put up to 1 of them on top of your library, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Then, if there are 5 basic land types among lands you control, draw a card. So, a 4 mana 2/4 flying is like a C- usually, and this has some pretty massive upside, and maybe that upside's a little underpowered compared to some of what we've seen, because if you don't have the full 5 land types, it just gives you a bit of card selection, and that's nice for sure, but it's not that strong, compared to Garna, which when it does its thing, you just get to draw a whole card. Like, that's way better than this. But you do make sure your draws are going to be better than your opponents, and ultimately, if you can get a domain of 5, if you get all 5 land types in play, then Niall gets to be pretty ridiculous because you get to draw a card every time you hit your opponent. And obviously, blue-green is really well positioned to get those 5 land types into play. So yeah, I think overall, Niall is a B-. Next up, it's Najal, the Stormrunner, who for 2 generic, 2 blue, and a red is a 5/4 legendary Ifrit wizard at uncommon, and you may cast sorcery spells as though they had flash, and whenever Najal, the Stormrunner, attacks, you can pay 2 generic, and if you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. This offers a couple of pretty nice payoffs for spells. Obviously, you need to be stocked up on them to take full advantage, and even when you are, there will be times where you can't make use of either ability. Still, the upside is real, and obviously blue-red is going to be a deck with a bunch of spells and spell payoffs, so this will have a very welcoming home. It does have the downside that it has to attack to copy spells, and that matters because it's not like a 5/4 is invincible or something. But yeah, another really good signpost uncommon. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Namada, Primeval Warden, who for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 3/4 legendary treefolk at rare with reach, and if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. Whenever you do, create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. You can also pay 1 green and sack a sapperling, and Namada Primeval Warden gets +2/+2 until end of turn, or you can pay 1 generic and a black and sack 2 sapperlings to draw a card. So the original Namada was one of my favorite cards from the original Invasion block, so it's fun to see this awesome treefolk again. Exiling opposing creatures when they die is always surprisingly useful, as it not only turns off recursion, but death triggers, which there are a lot of these days. The real value here is getting a sapperling every time that happens, of course, and then also having ways to cash in those sapperlings for very real value is nice too. And it all comes attached to a very reasonable 4 mana, 3/4 reach body. One unfortunate thing is there aren't a ton of other sapperlings in this set. If there were, sort of like our last visit to Dominaria, I think Namada would be even better. But as is, Namada is probably just a B. It's going to be the main way you're generating sapperling tokens. And it can fuel itself, but killing your opponent's stuff and getting the sapperlings and all of that does mean you have to jump through some hoops. Next up, it's Queen Alanal of Ruadak, who for a green and 2 white is a star legendary elf noble at uncommon, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control, and if 1 or more creature tokens would be created under your control, those tokens plus a 1/1 white soldier creature token are created instead. Another very nice signpost uncommon. It'll often be big enough to be reasonably efficient, and the extra tokens it can generate will be pretty nice. There's lots of ways to make tokens in green-white. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Radha, Coalition Warlord, which for 2 generic, a red and a green, is a 3/3 legendary elf warrior at uncommon. She's got Domain, and whenever she becomes tapped, another target creature you control gets +X until end of turn, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. This is one of the weaker signpost uncommons, but I think it's still pretty good. The problem is that Rada can't buff herself, so she is quite vulnerable when attacking, and she starts out as a hill giant, which isn't awesome. But because the ability triggers when she taps, you can use her with Enlist or with vehicles, and that's probably the best way to take advantage, since then she isn't vulnerable, she just offers a big stats boost to something. I'm giving her a C+. Next up, it's Wrath, Weatherlight Stalwart, which for a white and a blue is a 1/3 legendary human wizard at uncommon, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control. If you do, draw a card, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 white, and creatures you control get +1/+1, and gain vigilance until end of turn. This is an awesome signpost uncommon too. Tapping things to draw extra cards is pretty good, and he comes with the ability to buff the whole board. And he's interesting. This archetype in general is interesting. Blue-white looks like it's a spell deck that likes to go wide, and that's sort of what you're seeing embodied by Raph here. He likes spells, but he also likes you to have a very wide board. So cards that make creature tokens that are instants or sorceries are going to be really good fits for the deck. And either way, his ability to give +1/+1 in vigilance is a pretty nice one to have, especially on a reasonably costed creature with an additional ability. This is another B. Next up, it's Rada Drabik of Urborg, who for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/3 legendary zombie wizard at rare. It's got Vigilance in Ward 2. Other zombies you control have Vigilance, and whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and it's a 2/2 black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. A 4-mana 3/3 with Vigilance in Ward 2 is probably a C- at the very best, and this format has zombies and legendary creatures, but not so many of either of them that this is going to be like a crazy powerful build around. Still, you know, if your deck has like 2 other zombies in it and 2 other legendaries in it, this thing will be pretty nice. And I think that's kind of a reasonable expectation. I think overall it is held back by what's going on in this format on the whole, but yeah, I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Rith, Liberated Primeval, who for 2 generic, a red, a green, and a white, is a 5/5 legendary dragon at Mythic rare with flying in Ward 2. Other dragons you control have Ward 2, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature or planeswalker an opponent controlled was dealt excess damage this turn, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. I am already all in on a 5-mana 5/5 with flying in Ward 2, so the other upside is very nice. It also makes things really hard on your opponent. Even the turn Rith comes down, there will be an immediate impact, because now if they decide to chump block the stuff you already have in play, or if they wanted to trade like their 3/2 for your 3/3, things suddenly get really ugly for them. They just have to start taking hits, or they give you dragons, which is even more of a problem. And it looks like this will be at its best, perhaps, in like a red-white deck, because that deck has higher power than toughness, so trades are usually going to do excess damage. Things won't always line up that way, where you play Rith and suddenly just have way better attacks than you did before, but it'll happen often enough. And the baseline here is still an incredibly efficient, hard-to-kill flyer. This is a bomb, giving it an A. Next, it is Rivaz of the Claw, which for 1 generic, a black and a red, is a 3/3 legendary Viashino Warlock at rare with Menace. You can tap it to add 2 mana of any combination of colors, but you can only cast dragon creature spells with that mana. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon from your graveyard, and whenever you cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard, it gains when this creature dies, exile it. So, kind of like with artifacts and legendaries, it doesn't really look like this set has so many dragons in it for this to be a super powerful card, but it has a baseline as a 3-mana 3/3 with Menace, which is something you just always play anyway. So even if you have one other dragon in your deck, you're going to love the additional upside Rivaz can give you. And obviously, if you end up with multiple dragons, Rivaz does get pretty absurd, but it's going to be hard enough to build around. I don't think we need to give it a build around grade. I'm just going to say it's a B-. Next up, it is Rona, Sheoldred's Faithful, which for 1 generic, a blue, and 2 black, is a 3/4 legendary human wizard at uncommon. And whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 1 life, and you can cast Rona from your graveyard by discarding 2 cards in addition to paying its other costs. So blue-black is also a spell deck, so blue-black, blue-white, and blue-red all into spells in this format. They sort of take different angles. In the case of blue-black, it's more of a control/graveyard deck. And making your opponent's life total go down by casting spells is pretty nice, as is the fact that you can bring Rona back from the graveyard in the later stages of the game. It is costly to bring her back, and it isn't the kind of thing you're going to do in every game. But in the late game, if you're flooding out, just being able to pull her out of the graveyard and put a 3/4 on the board is going to be pretty nice. This is another solid Signpost Uncommon, giving it a B-. Next up, it is Rulik Mon's Warden Chief, which for 1 generic, a green, and 2 red is a 3/3 legendary goblin at Uncommon. It's got Menace, and when it attacks, you look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you can put it onto the battlefield tapped. If you didn't put a card onto the battlefield this way, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. So this is a pretty nice attack trigger. Whether you get a land on the table or a 1/1 goblin, you'll be pretty happy. Note, by the way, even if it is a land and you'd rather have the 1/1, you can choose to get the 1/1. I think most of the time getting that land will be better, both because it digs you 1 card deeper into your deck and because it ramps you. But keep in mind, you can just get the 1/1 no matter what. It also has Menace, so it means it will be able to attack fairly effectively on most boards. And most boards, your opponent's going to have to lose at least one thing when they block this, thanks to Menace. But it is an undersized creature that wants you to be attacking with it, and that's not great. So it's not quite a straight up B level Signpost Uncommon for me. I'm going to start it at B- though. Next up, it is Shanna, Purifying Blade, who costs green, white, blue, is a 3/3 legendary human warrior at Mythic with lifelink, and at the beginning of your instep, you can pay X. If you do, draw X cards. X can't be greater than the amount of life you gained this turn. A 3-mana 3/3 with lifelink is nice, even if it's a little challenging to cast, so the big life gain payoff she brings along for the ride is amazing. On her own, she can threaten to draw you 3 cards at a time. Obviously, making that happen all the time is a pipe dream because she can die in combat fairly easily, and if she's gone, you don't get to use her ability during your instep. But there will be occasions where your opponent just can't take her down, and you just get to draw 3 cards at the end of your turn after hitting them, at which point you probably just win. And if you have other life gain around, and it is around, she gets really silly. Even if she's just drawing you 1 card a turn or whatever, that is going to win you the game. Within the 3 colors she's in, there's enough random life gain all around that I don't really think this is a card that needs a build around. First of all, she can fuel herself, and second of all, you're just going to sort of organically end up with a deck that has enough ways to gain life to make her work. Obviously, if you have her, you want to value life gain a little more than you would otherwise. I do think she falls a little short of being a bomb just because her effect isn't always going to do something. When you get it online, it probably wins you the game and she feels like an A+, but there's going to be times where you just can't get it online. And in those situations, she's going to feel like a B at best. So I'm giving her a B+ overall. Next up, it is Solkanar the Tainted, who for 2 generic, a blue, a black, and a red is a 5/5 legendary elemental demon at Mythic rare, and at the beginning of your instep, you choose one that hasn't been chosen. You draw a card, or each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, or Solkanar the Tainted deals 3 damage to up to 1 other target creature or planeswalker, or you exile Solkanar, then return it to the battlefield under an opponent's control. So this is a fun callback to an old mediocre Legends card. Obviously, he sports some solid stats and some powerful effects, but the downside is your opponent eventually gets to gain control of Solkanar and use those effects too. The good news is the value you get from drawing a card, draining 2 life, and bolting a creature, combined with your 5-mana 5/5, will frequently be enough to win you the game before that matters. Obviously, that is still some very real downside, because you have a clock that you have to race, and you won't always find a situation where you can get the job done with this. But playing this alongside some sacrifice effects might be a good way to get around that. Obviously enough, the downside holds it back, and I think it holds it back enough that this is just a B, which means it's a very good card, but not a bomb. Next up, it is Soul of Windgrace, which for 1 generic, a black, a red, and a green is a 5/4 legendary cat avatar at Mythic rare. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can put a land card from a graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. You can pay 1 green and discard a land to gain 3 life. You can pay 1 generic and a red and discard a land to draw a card. Or you can pay 2 generic and a black and discard a land to have Soul of Windgrace gain indestructible until end of turn, and then you tap it. This seems really good. It's a little hard to cast, but his multiple abilities, combined with his ability to bring back the lands you discard, is pretty nice. You can also steal your opponent's graveyard lands too, by the way. Gaining life can really stabilize you, drawing cards helps you find an answer, and making him indestructible means you can attack with him as a 5/4 beat stick. It is unfortunate he only wants you to discard lands, but the upside there is that most of the time for an effect that makes you discard something to get an effect, you want to be discarding a land anyway, but obviously it is a bit of a bummer you can't just discard any card for these effects. Still, he looks really powerful to me. He's definitely going to take over some games. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it is Sten, Paranoid Partisan, who for a white and a blue is a 2/2 legendary human wizard at rare. When he enters the battlefield, you choose a card type other than creature or land. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast, and you can pay 1 generic, a white, and a blue to exile Sten and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, reducing the cost of an entire card type is nice, even if this does limit what you can choose. And in limited, creature is usually going to be the thing you want to choose. The good news is the blue-white deck is also into instants and sorceries as we've seen, and it's also neat that he can flicker himself, which allows him to avoid removal, allows him to block every turn if you're in a pinch, and also lets you change what you've named, if that matters, although obviously paying 3 to change what you named is still going to result in you losing mana most of the time, but hey, you can change what you named with him. Still, there are going to be games where this is just a 2/2 that doesn't really do anything, and it's not that good as a late game card. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it is Tatyova, Steward of Tides, who for 2 green and a blue is a 3/3 legendary merfolk druid at uncommon. Land creatures you control have flying, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands up to 1 target land you control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with haste. It's still a land. While I think I prefer the Tatyova we saw in the last visit to Dominaria, they did give her another very strong signpost uncommon. Animating your lands when they enter the battlefield is really strong, especially because they'll fly. Obviously enough, blue-green is about ramping and lands, and she fits in quite nicely there. It looks like the color pair has a good amount of support overall. The downside is she's basically a ramp payoff, so if you play her in the early game, she's mostly just going to be a 3-mana 3/3, which is fine, but it also means there's a good chance she dies before she ever gets going. But, you know, she's going to take over late games and really feel like an insane uncommon in a lot of late games where you're just, like, every land you draw becomes a permanent 3/3 flying creature, which is pretty awesome. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it is Tori de Avenant, Fury Rider, which for 1 generic, 2 red, and a white is a 3/3 human knight at uncommon. It's got vigilance and trample, and whenever it attacks, all other attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Other red attacking creatures you control gain trample until end of turn. Untap each other white attacking creature you control. So attacking with this is going to be pretty awesome on most boards. It buffs all your creatures, and it's enough to make almost any creature into a much better attacker. The downside is you have a Grey Ogre that can die relatively easy in combat, but chances are good that when you attack with it, it's going to be worth it, because you just need like 3 other creatures and it suddenly is amazing. As long as it at least trades while buffing your whole board, you're going to feel fine about it. I'm giving this a B. This is strong. It has stats that are almost passable and has a huge payoff for casting instant and sorcery spells. As we've seen, that color pair is about spells and going wide, and this nicely checks both of those boxes for you. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it is Urg, Spawn of Turg, which for 2 black and a green is a star 5 legendary frog beast at uncommon. Its power is equal to the number of land cards in your graveyard. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. You may put that card into your graveyard, and you can pay a black and a green and sack a land to gain 2 life. This is another fairly good signpost uncommon, but I do think it's another one that probably falls below, a B- level card. It starts out pretty small, but the card selection and graveyard loading ability it brings you is actually pretty nice, because it synergizes with graveyard stuff to begin with. The ability to give up lands for life will come up some too. The fact that you need lands in your graveyard is what really holds me back on this card, because that means basically you have to be getting them there via self-mill or discard effects, and that's a lot harder than just having anything in your graveyard help him be a better creature, because other kinds of cards end up in the graveyard by being cast or by trading for something. So there are going to be times, especially in the late game, where this is huge. Black-green is a graveyard deck, of course, a graveyard deck that likes lands, so, it all makes sense together. But I do think he's probably only a C+. I don't think he's quite powerful enough as a signpost uncommon to pull me into that color pair the way a lot of the others are. Next up, it is Vohar Vodalian Desecrator, which for a blue and a black is a 1/2 legendary Phyrexian Merfolk Wizard at uncommon. You can tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. If you discard an instant or sorcery card this way, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. You can pay 2 and sacrifice Vohar, and you may cast an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead, activate only as a sorcery. So a 2-mana 1/2 that loots is something that's already about a C+. You know, making your draws that much better is a big deal. And the upside of draining the opponent sometimes and letting you cast spells out of your graveyard is nice. You aren't always going to want to discard an instant or sorcery card to this, of course. But you do have something of a clock in play if you can consistently discard instants and sorceries, and it can, of course, also get back an instant or sorcery, though it can only do that 1 time. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it is Zar Ojanen, Scion of Efrava, which for 3 generic, a green and a white, is a 4/4 legendary cat warrior at uncommon, and it's got a domain effect. When it becomes tapped, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with toughness less than the number of basic land types among lands you control. So this is another very nice signpost uncommon. Its ability will trigger when you attack, or if you enlist. That's not a mechanic on any multicolored cards in the set, as you can see, but it's a mechanic that involves tapping one of your creatures to pump the power of another creature. So Zar Ojanen goes really well with Enlist, especially because attacking with a 5-mana 4/4, like a lot of these cards that have these attack triggers, there's a lot of them in this set, in the signpost uncommon category. Attacking with a creature like that is a little dangerous because it doesn't buff itself unless you have 5, lands of each, 1 land of each type in play, which you're not going to be able to do that often. So it can easily die in combat, but it does permanently buff all of your other creatures, even if it is attacking and dies. Just buffing all your 1/1s or all your 2/2s is going to be very doable. So looks like another pretty good signpost uncommon to me. I'm giving it a B-. And our last multicolored card is Zur, Eternal Schemer, which for a white, a blue, and a black is a 1/4 legendary human wizard at Mythic Rare. That's right, Zur is back. He's got flying, and enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. And you can pay 1 generic and a white, and target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature, in addition to its other types, and has base power and base toughness, each equal to its mana value. So the original Zur is a fan favorite card, so I love that they brought him back. This format, though, doesn't have any enchantment creatures in it, so the fact he gives them Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof really only applies to his own ability, where he can reanimate, or just animate rather, non-aura enchantments. So this is definitely a build-around, and enchantments are in the set, but they aren't a major theme. I do think it's possible to build around Zur. There are enough enchantments that you can do that. And, if you end up in a deck in all 3 of these colors and you have like 2 enchantments, you probably play them just for the upside. And I think that's a pretty plausible outcome overall. So, I think he's a build-around, but I don't think he's a complete disaster to play if your mana's good and you can play these 3 colors. He's probably like a C, because you'll have 1 or 2 things he can animate, and then he's okay-ish on his own. But if you end up in a deck that has a lot of non-aura enchantments, and by a lot of I just mean like 5 or 6 or something, then he can be pretty absurd. He can really take over the game by animating all of these enchantments that are very good at attacking, blocking, and hard to kill. So I think he has a ceiling as a B+. It's pretty interesting. It would have been pretty interesting to print him in like Kamigawa. It wouldn't have made any sense, of course, because he lives in Dominaria. But this would have been an utterly busted card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty because you had so many things you could animate with the ability. And then you have creatures that are always enchantment creatures in the set who would all just come into play and have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. Not the case here. This is where a format really defines how good a card can be, because this would have been like an A+ in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Doesn't even really need a build-around grade there. Here, it's going to be like a C in your typical Esper deck, and it has a ceiling of a B+. Our first artifact is Automatic Librarian, which for 3 generic mana is an artifact creature construct at common. It's a 3/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2. This is pretty much the same card as Chrome Cat, a card that usually didn't make the cut in Streets of New Capenna, and that's probably true of this card here too. This format, as we've seen, has some artifact stuff going on, but it's not a primary theme in the set. That does mean maybe it's a little bit better than Chrome Cat, though. So it's not a disaster to play this thing if you really need some more creatures in your deck or you need some artifacts, but I think most of the time you're going to prefer to cut this card. And I think that means it's just a D+. Next up, it's Golden Argosy, which for 4 generic mana is a 3/6 legendary artifact vehicle at rare, and when it attacks, you exile each creature that crewed it this turn, return them to the battlefield tapped under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and you can crew it for 1. So this is a pretty cool design. 3/6 is decent size, especially for crew 1, although I don't love paying 4 mana for it and still needing to crew it. The idea is that you can use this to rebuy into the battlefield abilities and other things when you crew it, like save a creature that's been shut down by an aura, and that will be nice, but most of the time this is just going to feel like a big vanilla creature. It's just a C. Next up, it's Hero's Heirloom, which for 2 generic mana is an uncommon artifact equipment. It says equipped creature gets +2/+1, and as long as equipped creature is legendary, it has trample and haste, and you can equip it for 2. This is pretty solid equipment, even without the legendary upside. 2 to play and 2 to equip for this boost is probably a C-, so the legendary upside does matter. And of course, as I've said, you're not going to end up with like 10 legendaries in your deck, but since this is already a serviceable equipment, if you end up with like 2 to 4 legends in your deck, which is a reasonable expectation, I imagine you'll play the first copy of this most of the time. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Inscribed Tablet, which for 1 generic mana is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 and tap it and sacrifice it. You reveal the top 5 cards of your library, you put a land card from among them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't put a card into your hand this way, draw a card. I don't like this very much. Yes, it's an artifact that just replaces itself, and there are some artifact payoffs in the set, but the effect is just so underwhelming. You really can't count on it as a source of fixing, since even in Limited, looking at the top 5 is no guarantee to find a splash color. It is definitely good at making sure you hit your 3rd land drop or whatever, and that does matter, and I like that you get a card even if you whiff, but I'm just not very impressed with this. It doesn't feel like it does enough, even replacing itself. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Joda's Codex, which for 5 generic is an uncommon artifact. It has a domain effect. You pay 5 generic and tap it to draw a card, and this ability costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. This is a fun reference to a bunch of old Magic tome cards like Jayemdae Tome that cost a ton of mana to draw you cards. Now, luckily in this case you can lower the cost here, and I guess once you get it down to about 2, you won't feel too bad about it. But you still have to pay a whopping 5 mana up front to not add a real thing to the board, and the advantage this can build for you is very slow. I don't like any of that. This seems too clunky, even in a deck that can get to 5 consistently. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Karn's Silex, which for 3 generic mana is a legendary artifact at Mythic Rare. It enters the battlefield tapped. Players can't pay life to cast spells or to activate abilities that aren't mana abilities, and you can pay X and tap it and exile it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X or less, activate only as a sorcery. This is a little slow, but obviously super powerful. It's a board sweeper effect that you can customize to some extent, which means you can set it up in a way that hurts your opponent more than it hurts you in many situations. The fact it enters tapped is a bummer, because it means you won't be able to get your opponent to add more permanents to the board for that turn, and they can prepare themselves for the eventual cracking of the Silex. You can only do it at sorcery speed, so that also means they know they're safe on their own turn, so this is really powerful. But I think the clunkiness of it all makes it fall a little bit short of being a bomb. Taking a whole turn to get online is a problem. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Meteorite, which for 5 generic mana is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it does 2 to any target, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. This is a super clunky way to fix your mana, and adding shock to the mix doesn't make a huge difference for me. This wasn't very good last time we saw it, and I don't think it's very good here, even in a set that has a bit of an artifact sub-theme. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Relic of Legends, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and you can tap an untapped legendary creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. Most 3 mana rocks, even those that tap for any color, aren't very good in Limited. This could end up being better if the format is slow enough, but playing something like this on turn 3 can put you really far behind. This does come with the cool additional upside of producing a ton of extra mana, provided you have legendary creatures to tap. I can definitely see a situation where there's a ramp deck that somebody drafts that has like 6 or 7 legendary creatures in it, and this becomes a lot better, but I think the typical outcome with this kind of card is that it's going to feel like a C-. Next up, it's Salvaged Mana Worker, which for 2 generic is a 1/3 artifact creature construct at common, and you can pay 1 generic mana and add 1 mana of any color, and you can activate only once each turn. So we see a card like this a lot, but usually it costs 2 mana to filter the mana, and only costing 1 to filter the mana is pretty sweet, especially in a format where you're very likely to be splashing at least a 3rd color to pay for off-color kicker costs and stuff like that. It is a little bit of a bummer you can only do it once each turn, but it would probably be a little too good in this format if you could do it as many times as you wanted in a turn. As is, I think it's a perfectly solid 2-drop and going to be especially useful in any deck that's trying to run, 3, 4, or maybe even 5 colors, giving it a C. Next up, it's Shield Wall Sentinel, which for 4 generic is a 1/3 artifact creature golem at common. It's got Defender, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with Defender, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So there is a Defender deck in this format. We'll see more of it throughout this week, and we'll actually see one more Defender payoff in this video. And they're all basically build-arounds. You can't really just be having one of these Defender payoffs in your deck, because then they're not really going to do anything. So if you can use this to tutor something up, especially one of the potentially powerful win conditions the Defender deck has, this is going to feel pretty good. But if your deck has like one other Defender in it and it's a super mediocre card, you don't really want to play it because the stats here are awful. So it's an F in a deck that doesn't have Defenders worth searching up, but a C+ in the Defender deck, which looks like a very real deck in the format. Next up, it's Timeless Lotus, which for 5 generic is a mythic rare legendary artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap to add 1 mana of each color. So this does give you a huge mana boost and fixes your mana perfectly, which is cool. But even in this format, I don't envision giving this much of a bump to your mana is going to be that great. It's hard to find something to do with a bunch of mana in most limited formats, even in a format with a bunch of kicker, so it is often better to spend 5 mana on like a creature or a removal spell than it is on something that won't do anything for you for an entire turn, and even when it does do the thing for you, you might not be able to take advantage. I could see this working out in some pretty crazy ramp or 5-color decks in the format, but I think for the most part, playing this isn't worth your time. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Vanquisher's Axe, which for 1 generic is an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +2/+0, and you can equip it for 2. This isn't the most efficient equipment ever, but it isn't a disaster either. It may be particularly good in red-white, where you want higher attack than toughness, and it also helps the equipment and artifact sub-themes in the set. Still, it probably gets cut from a significant number of decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Walking Bulwark, which for 1 generic mana is a 0/3 artifact creature golem at uncommon. It's got Defender, and you can pay 2 generic until end of turn. Target creature with Defender gains haste, can attack as though it didn't have Defender, and assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is really interesting. On its own, it's sort of like a 1 mana 0/3 that can lose Defender and get +3/+0 in haste if you pay 2 mana. That's not a terrible card. And obviously, it gets better the more Defenders you have. And there is, as we've said, a Defender deck in this format. This seems like a decent enough 1-drop for really any kind of deck. Maybe not a really aggressive deck, but for most other decks. So while I do think this is a build-around, I think it kind of has a floor around a C. And I think it gets all the way up to B level in a deck that really gets there on Defenders. Next up, it's Weatherlight Completed, which for 2 generic is a 5/5 legendary artifact vehicle at mythic rare. It has flying, and as long as it has 4 or more Phyresis counters on it, it's a Phyrexian creature in addition to its other types. And whenever a creature you control dies, put a Phyresis counter on Weatherlight Completed, then draw a card if it has 7 or more Phyresis counters on it. If it doesn't, scry 1. As cool as it is to see the Weatherlight Phyrexianized, this card looks awful for limited. It begins as a 2-mana artifact that lets you scry 1 anytime one of your creatures dies, and that is not good. It does eventually become a creature and then start drawing you cards when stuff dies, but this is going to be so very slow. It just needs too many counters. It's a miserable top deck. I guess the ideal plan is to play it on like turn 2, but you also aren't really adding to the board on turn 2 if that's what you're doing. So I think this is just an F. It's too slow and too much work for limited. So now we're moving to lands. There are pain lands in this set. There are 6 of them. Not every color pair has one, but the 6 there are all look like this. They're rare lands. You can tap them for colorless, or you can tap them for 1 of 2 colors of mana, and they do 1 damage to you. These are nice fixing. It's great that they can tap for colorless and you don't always have to take damage when you tap them. And when they do fix your mana, it feels pretty good. Fixing your mana is going to be extra important in this format because you're going to be splashing a third color so often so that you are able to pay off-color kicker costs and stuff like that. I think these are collectively a C+. Next up, it's Thran Portal, which is a rare land gate. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a basic land type. It's the chosen type in addition to its other types, and mana abilities of Thran Portal cost an additional 1 life to activate. So the gate type doesn't matter in this format, but this is a nice land anyway. It enters untapped in the early game, so if you have lots of 1 and 2 drops, you don't have to worry about that. And obviously, it also helps you fix your mana a ton. It also takes on a basic land type, which matters for domain. It's about as good as the Pain lands overall, though I think it has the benefit of being a card you can grab for fixing of any kind during the draft, and again, also having a basic land type. That upside is sort of canceled out by the fact that it can only tap for mana of a single color, and it will often enter the battlefield tapped, unlike the Pain lands. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Crystal Grotto, which is a common land, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, you can tap it for colorless, or you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Even in a set with a multicolor theme, I'm not into this. Filter lands are almost always not worth the trouble, and I think that will be especially true in this set, which has a ton of better fixing. Filtering mana does fix, but at the cost of making everything of that color cost 1 extra. You're basically tapping 2 lands in this case to produce 1 colored mana, and that's a big downside. Adding Scry 1 to the mix doesn't make enough of a difference. You'll play this if you're really desperate for fixing, but I don't foresee that happening very often. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Plaza of Heroes, a rare land that you can tap for colorless. You can add 1 mana of any color, spend this mana only to cast a legendary spell. You can also tap it to add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control, or you can pay 3 and tap it and exile it to give target legendary creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. As I've said throughout this video, this format does have a lot of legendaries in it. Every booster pack has at least 1 legendary creature, but I still don't feel like you can run a card like this in 99% of decks, and that's because the fail case is pretty bad. All it can do is tap for colorless. And that does a ton of damage to your mana base, especially in a format where, again, you'll often be wanting to at least splash a third color. So you need this to much more consistently add some sort of colored mana for you, and it just won't be capable of doing it often enough. I think this is just an F. All right, and last we have one more cycle. It's a cycle of lands that enter the battlefield tapped, but they also have the ability to tap for 2 colors of mana, and they have 2 basic land types. So Contaminated Aquifer is the exemplar we have here. It's an island swamp at common. So the fact these have land types is a pretty big deal because it will really make domain decks in the format far more functional. I also think that means that even though these come into play tapped, I think you probably want to value them a little higher on your pick order than the Pain lands, which are, of course, rares. At least once it's clear you're going to be in one of the domain decks, because just jamming these lands into your deck is going to make it a lot better if you have 7 or 8 cards with domain. I think this will be valued somewhat similarly to how we looked at snow lands back in Kaldheim, which means they're lands that you should be taking relatively highly. They're also useful, of course, in decks without a domain theme because of the fixing they provide. And lots of decks in this format, as I've said many times, will be looking to splash at least a third color because of all the off-color kicker, as we'll see later in the week. So, like the Pain lands, I think these are collectively a C+, and they might even be a higher C+ than the Pain lands. It's confusing because if you have a deck that doesn't care about domain at all, the Pain lands are obviously better, but there's so much domain in the format, especially in like the Naya colors, that you're going to frequently end up in a deck that has a few cards that care about basic land types. So yeah, these lands are C+. So those are my thoughts on every single multicolored and colorless card in Dominaria United. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about all the white cards, and we'll keep going with a video every day until we're done. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and a whole lot of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. If you're watching this later in the week and more of the set review is out, you'll also see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.